Welcome, everyone. My name is Aubrey Waymiller, and I am a member of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the 15th installment in our Fresh Fair webinar series. Today's webinar is called Spring Forward into FAIR, HEAL Data Management and Sharing Plans. This webinar will feature a presentation diving into specifics and examples for developing a HEAL compliant data management and sharing plan. The presentation will be followed by a live Q&A session. If at any point you have a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box, and we will bring it up during the Q&A session. We could move forward in the slides, please. Awesome. And one more. Excellent, thank you. I'm excited to introduce our presenter for today, Mary Hannah Currin. Mary Hannah is a research data analyst at RTI International. She has experience in clinical research recruitment and database management, having worked for over 4 years at the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities, where she coordinated recruitment efforts for a variety of research studies and managed several recruitment databases maintained by the CIDD. She also has experience in academic and specialized libraries and holds an ALA accredited degree in information science. She previously worked as librarian for the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards at the RTP campus of the EPA. She is a member of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group and helps develop guidance for data management, data curation, and data strategy. And with that, I'll pass it over to Mary Hannah to begin the presentation.
Great, thanks Aubrey, and thank you all for joining us today for our second presentation on data management and sharing plans. If you missed the first presentation that we did, it's available on our webinar page, and I encourage you to go and look at it. In our first presentation, we gave an overview of the data management and sharing plan policy, what it meant to be HEAL compliant, and also talked about the new NIH policy that went into effect on January 25th of this year. In this presentation, we wanted to dive deeper into the topic by providing an overview of the policy change and best practices and walking through a completed HEAL data management and sharing plan example provided by one of the HEAL studies. We're going to also be reviewing some resources at the end of this presentation, and we'll be following all of that with a Q&A like Aubrey mentioned. So starting with some background, the HEAL policy has already required data management and sharing plans paired with the HEAL implementation requirements, like selecting a HEAL compliant repository. NIH also has a general data management and sharing plan policy that recently was updated this year. And for awards given after the new policy change on January 25th of 2023, studies are now required to submit a data management and sharing plan at the point of application. So for HEAL researchers, these data management and sharing plans are going to be assessed by the HEAL program officers. This is a comparison table that's available on the NIH website, and I thought it would be kind of interesting. Again, this has to do with the general NIH policy, but it highlights a variety of components of the data management and sharing policies before and after the 2023 policy change. And it can be a useful reference to understand how some of those requirements were before and after that date. So with all of those policies in mind, HEAL stewards do have some recommendations for PIs, and your overall goal should be to make sure that these plans include all of the components of the elements of the NIH data management and sharing plan template, but also align with the requirements that make your data HEAL compliant. So these include selecting a HEAL compliant repository, registering your study on the HEAL platform, submitting your study level metadata to the HEAL platform through CEDAR, which is the study level metadata submission form, using HEAL core common data elements if you are a pain clinical study, and using broad consent language if you are able. So we also recommend that you think of these data management and sharing plans as living documents. And as your study changes and time goes on, you'll want to revisit them and make sure that your plan is reflective of your study and the data management and sharing plan that you have laid out. So today we're going to walk through a HEAL data management and sharing plan provided by the Signature for Pain Recovery in Teens, or SPRINT study out of Stanford. And this was completed by Dr. Emma Biggs. And we just want to quickly thank them for letting us share it here today and walking through it with all of you. So these are the 6 elements that we're going to be walking through today. And as many of you probably know, you have the 6 major elements of the DMSP template, but then some of these also have subcomponents as well. So we'll be walking through each of those subcomponents. So for element 1, which is data type, this element has 3 subcomponents, and it's the types and amounts of anticipated scientific data that your study is going to be generating, and the plans for preservation. So basically what you're going to keep and the metadata and tools that will help to interpret that data. The information from this element is also going to be really helpful in informing your selection of a data repository. So since this is a full data management and sharing plan and has a lot of text, we're going to go through each example, and I'm just going to highlight some of the aspects that make this a good DMSP, and then also go over the aspects that could be improved. Starting out with data type section 1, which is the types and amounts of scientific data expected to be generated by the project. You see here that they did a good job of listing out all of the different data types to be included with the amount of information that they're sharing and the number of data types as well. So I might recommend separating out different data types into structured paragraphs in this section. That way you might be able to read it more clearly, and you can kind of segment each section by data type and then continue to do that throughout the DMSP, but they do have the information there. It just might make it easier on you later on to have those separated into their own paragraphs. They noted questionnaires and self-reports and several other types of information, including MRI imaging, and also noted different collection methods and how information would be prepared for storage and processing. So when I read through this example, what I liked about it is that as an outsider, I feel like I'm able to imagine all of those different data types that they're producing, the different vehicles through which they're coming, and then it just kind of paints an overall picture of the data very well. So for section 2 of data type, which is scientific data that will be preserved and shared, and the rationale for doing so, this study emphasized being in line with the FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we have emphasized FAIR in a lot of the HEAL stewards guidance. And so I was really happy to see that mentioned in this plan. They also mentioned the de-identified underlying primary data and secondary level process data to be deposited into repositories, and mention the applicable analysis code that's going to further support usability later on in secondary research. And then also they mentioned the applicable institutional policies that apply to their data as well. So data type section 3 is where HEAL compliance really starts to come into play, and it is metadata, other relevant data, and associated documentation. So we see here that they emphasized the study metadata that will be available on the HEAL Central Catalog and CEDAR entry. And CEDAR is the form that's used for study level metadata submission. We have some resources about that in the chat. Noting that your study level metadata will be submitted through the CEDAR form and available on the HEAL platform is an important component of being HEAL compliant. And actually our next Fresh Fair webinar on May 18th is going to cover how to submit your study level metadata via CEDAR. So be on the lookout in the coming weeks for more information on registration if you are interested in that. The study also mentions the study protocol along with open access publications and dataset descriptions, including data dictionaries. And these can be very important in preserving the context of your data. So I was happy to see that they also included those as associated documentation. So element 2 is related tools, software, and/or code. And this is what's needed to access your information. So we suggest that information be broadly accessible, and this can be partially facilitated by your selection of a repository. In this element, they mentioned that underlying raw data will be in open source CSV format, and that underlying raw MRI data will be available in .NII format that requires a specialized software that's also freely available. They also note, again, that analysis code for both of these will be available on GitHub. And I think this is a thorough description, but again, this could be one element where you structure it in separate paragraphs based on data type, just for the sake of organization. So element 3, which is standards, it should reflect any common standards being used for your data or metadata. And there are a few HEAL compliance requirements for this element. So new HEAL pain studies should utilize the common core CDEs. And there are also optional supplemental CDEs that we recommend that you look at and see if you can use something that other studies are also utilizing. And that's just going to help later on with that interoperability component of this. So some CDEs are copyrighted and require licensing. And for the core CDEs that require licensing, NIH will purchase them. And investigators must provide NIH with certain information to obtain those licenses. And for any supplemental CDEs that require licenses, investigators need to obtain permission for use themselves and then share proof of that permission with the NIH CDE program and program managers before getting access to the CRFs. So if you have any questions about the study level or variable level metadata, you can always reach out to the HEAL stewards and we're happy to talk through that. So with standards, again, this study emphasized FAIR with naming descriptions that are organized by modality and data set descriptions that reflect provenance. And they also plan to use headers derived from Dublin Core, which is a very common standard. And the MRI data will be organized and named according to BID standards, which is brain imaging data structure. And this is an example of an element that does need a bit of an update. So this study uses pain HEAL CDE since they are a pain clinical study, and they plan on including that information in a future iteration of the data management and sharing plan. So I think this is a great example of, they already have some great information in there. They have that HEAL compliancy requirement and they're doing it. They just need to update it in their plan as well. So element 4 is another element with 3 subsections, and it is what repository you're going to use for your data, how your information will be findable and identifiable, and how long the information will be accessible. And you need to indicate your anticipated HEAL compliant repository and make your information accessible as soon as you can. So the first section of this element is the repository where your scientific data and metadata will be archived. And here you can see they indicated multiple repositories based on data type, including Open Science Framework for some primary data and Open Neuro for the MRI data. And they also mentioned the analysis code available on GitHub. And again, we see them further emphasizing the FAIR principles and indicating that the metadata will help to provide clear provenance. I would also recommend that they revise their language from HEAL approved to HEAL compliant when describing repositories. And it's important to know that the HEAL stewards can help you with repository selection to help best match your data needs. And this is another element where it would help to have structured paragraphs, I think, for describing the preservation of each data type, especially since they're using different repositories. And the majority of data for this particular project is going into OSF and will be public or private based on the stage of the data and the institutional requirements that they mention. So you'll want to also keep in mind that HEAL does encourage data to be shared broadly. So for section 2 of element 4, which is how scientific data will be findable and identifiable, I didn't highlight anything for this particular section because I thought that this list that they included was very succinct and comprehensive. And they mentioned things like unique identifiers, persistent IDs, and that publications and study descriptions will include relevant mesh terms to make these resources easily searchable later on. You can always include more information if you would like, but I do think that this is a great example of checking off the boxes of being comprehensive, but not having to spend too much time on it. So the third section of data preservation is when and how long the scientific data will be made available. And NIH encourages scientific data to be shared as soon as possible and no later than the time of an associated publication or at the end of the performance period, whichever comes first. So this language can be used in your data management and sharing plan and is available on the NIH and HEAL websites. And I think that having that information from the policy will help hold you to that policy when you're looking through your data management and sharing plans. And they also indicate that the data will be preserved indefinitely. And language for this might possibly be able to be sourced through your repository. A lot of repositories have documentation on their websites about how long information is stored in the repository and their plans for if the repository ends up closing or anything like that. So sometimes you can grab that information directly from their page as well to make things a little bit easier. For element 5, which is access, distribution, or reuse considerations, and its factors affecting these categories, access controls and protections for human research participants. And in conjunction with human subject data protections, we recommend that you make your data as shareable as possible using broad consent language. And with that in mind, we also will want you to consider appropriate privacy protections even when information is de-identified. And we have included some additional human participant guidance on this slide. So for this study, they had some institutional restrictions for access and reuse. And they mentioned that a committee helps to approve this and that there's also a data use agreement involved between Stanford and the primary institution of the recipient of the data. I think this element could also talk a bit about the types of data and impact on access that might have. So for example, if you had a study with human subject data, you might mention that accessibility might be impacted based on privacy in that case. For section 2, whether access to the data will be controlled, they give more information about this institutional review committee and its restrictions on data access to ensure scientific integrity of studies conducted using the data. And there's also a materials transfer agreement and data use agreement mentioned. Section 3 is protections for privacy rights and confidentiality of human research participants. And here the study talks about how data shared will be de-identified and participants will also be asked for explicit permission to share their data. So if this is not granted, their data will not be deposited into the data repository. And they also mention their methods for de-identification like name, removal, and removal of certain dates. The final element is oversight of data management and sharing. And this is your plan of compliance. So who will be monitoring your compliance. And we also wanted to share in this slide the step-by-step guide for HEAL compliant data to help support your data management and sharing plan process. In this element, they indicated the individuals who would be responsible for the different components of oversight, including day-to-day reporting, data collection, and quality. And I think they did a good job of kind of segmenting out the individual who would be in charge, what they would be in charge of, and the scope of that work as well. And I know a lot of this is a lot of text, and for this particular presentation, we wanted to get through everything, but all of this will be recorded. So if you need to go back and review it in your own time more slowly, there is an option for that. But we wanted to make sure to give you the full thing, but get through the highlights. So feedback from the author. Emma really wanted to be here today, but was at a conference. So I was able to meet with her and talk through her experience and get some feedback. And I think she had a lot of great points that I wanted to share with you because I think a lot of people, these will resonate with them. So one thing that I've heard from several people, I think throughout this process and with the data management and sharing plan policy change, is that they're seeing all of these requirements coming from different areas, and it can be kind of overwhelming trying to approach a policy or a plan like this when thinking about all of these different requirements that you're being held to. So what Emma did was, prior to starting, she mapped out the different data sharing requirements and stakeholders that imposed them. So IRB, NIH, HEAL, her institution, and any other stakeholders she could think of. And I think having that mapped out and knowing what sort of requirements that you need to meet or compliancy requirements can be really helpful beforehand, so that you're thinking through it at the beginning rather than afterward. She also recommended using DMP tool, and this is a tool that the stewards have mentioned in past presentations as one we really like. She said that their guidance was very helpful and that it made the process, I think, a lot easier for her. And also, when reflecting on the process in general, her big takeaway was that she would have started earlier. And she also mentioned, they're a study that was creating a data management and sharing plan sort of later on in the process towards analysis, just based on the timeline, and they were not subject to that new policy date. So it might be harder for a study that hasn't made a lot of those decisions already to work through this plan and plan on writing everything out and including something that will be in the future rather than something that already is. For instance, having a repository in mind. So starting earlier rather than later, I think, can be very helpful in making sure that you have all your ducks in a row and are HEAL compliant and have had a chance to look at all of the resources that we have available. So talking about DMP tool for a second, since Emma used it, I thought it would be nice to just show it here. And if you have more interest in looking at it, you can go to their website. They have a lot of great resources. They also have a template for the new NIH policy and accompanying guidance that goes along with that. And this is just an example of one of the resources on their website where you can go in and fill in the blank for your data. So it's pretty seamless, and they have some sample answers as well. I always think it's kind of nice to see examples when going through something like this. So just an option for you to think about if you would like. And these are some additional resources, including our website, as well as our contact information. The HEAL stewards continue to support researchers in managing their data and meeting HEAL compliant requirements. So in summary, today we covered the data management and sharing policy change and went over best practices. We reviewed an example data management and sharing plan and provided resources, including DMP tool and guidance on our website, like the HEAL compliant roadmap. And I just want to reiterate to please contact us if you have any follow-up questions about any of this presentation or any of the resources that we shared here today. And with that, I will pass it back over to Aubrey to introduce the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Mary Hannah, and thank you for the great presentation. Now we'll invite our Q&A guests, Lucy Carr-Jones, Barry Hayes, and Anthony Juni to join us, and I'll ask them to turn on their cameras. We will now stop screen sharing to begin the Q&A session. The first question that we have is, does the new DMP tool integrate with all HEAL compliant repositories? And I think I'm going to direct it to Mary Hannah to start us off.
Thanks. Yeah, there isn't a current integration method with DMP tool in all of the HEAL repositories. There are some tools that are being built that might help with integration in the future. RSpace is one that we have looked at a little bit, and it does integrate with some of the repositories, but again, not all. So we will keep you updated if we do know about things that might help with that in the future.
Great, thank you. Our second question is, we want to use one of the approved repositories from ICPSR. However, because of budget constraints, the curated website within ICPSR is cost prohibitive. We want to therefore use the open repository instead of the curated repository for ICPSR. Is this acceptable for HEAL? And I think Anthony can field this one.
Yeah, so I really suggest to reach out to the HEAL stewards, because I think it would be great to understand both your study in more detail and some of the underlying data. Open ICPSR has slightly different technical infrastructure and ways in which it reviews sensitive data and controlled access data. So this might be of importance here. And in addition, HEAL has built a number of connections with a number of different repositories to potentially reduce the burden and cost for investigators. So we could explore what could be most appropriate here. So I think that could be a really relevant next step for you, is to reach out to the stewards and us, and we can help explore what options might be most appropriate.
Excellent, thanks, Anthony. Our third question is, regarding the change to the DMSP plan, since the current policy says the DMSP is part of terms and conditions, would changing the plan need prior approval? I'm going to direct this one to Lucy.
Great. So as Mary Hannah mentioned earlier, we do want to think about your DMSP as a living document. So because of that, there may be changes you want to make as your study proceeds. If that happens, the best thing to do is to talk to your program officer and just let them know what's happened, what you're planning, and make sure to get their approval for any changes.
Thanks so much. Our next question is, can we use the DMSP that was submitted in the funded grant, or do we need to compile a different one? Throw that to Mary Hannah.
Thanks. Yeah, so your program officer is going to be reviewing your data management and sharing plan for HEAL compliance. And they should let you know if it does need to be updated, if they're seeing it not meeting the appropriate requirements. And I would recommend directing any questions to them about this. If you do have questions about whether or not your plan meets certain requirements, they should be able to help you through that review process.
Great, thank you. Our next question is an open one, so any one of our panelists can jump in here. The question is related to both data collection, planning, and final data sharing. It's clear that the expectation for data collection is to use HEAL CDEs to define patient-reported outcomes in clinical studies. I assume this is also an expectation for data sharing submitted to a repository. Has any consideration been given to how HEAL CDEs relate to CDISC, SDTM controlled terminology? Is there any reason to expect compatibility between these two?
I'm happy to jump in here, and thank you so much for this question. It's a very, very exciting one. So we have within the HEAL data ecosystem, we've generated some ways of documenting variable level metadata that will allow for this or the underlying technical infrastructure for both documenting and crosswalking such ontological standards and control vocabularies and terminologies. So I encourage you to look at some of the processes that exist there, and as we continue to work through that. And in addition, we're working to think about ways of supporting documentation and further interoperability across such standards. So it's exciting to hear how far along you are and kind of ahead of the curve you are. So would really love to work with you further and hear more about your work as well, and to see how to further improve and support such interoperability.
Very exciting. Thanks. I actually have another question I want to direct to you, Anthony, and it is, what do we have to include related to proprietary data?
This is an excellent question. So I would encourage you, first of all, to reach out to your program officer, as there's a lot of nuances surrounding the policies and sort of nuances surrounding how long your data should be embargoed and other policies that might protect and how to balance IP and openness of your data sharing. But in regards to HEAL, we would certainly encourage you to document sort of what repositories you're selecting, the appropriate licenses that balance your IP protections, timelines for when your data will be released or embargoed in relation to your publication. In addition, certainly in addition to your data management plan, certainly encourage you to complete your study registration and completion of study level metadata, as this is a requirement of your HEAL award, and it will not potentially compromise any IP or intellectual property, and it would support just documentation and registering your study and all of that study level metadata.
Awesome. Thanks so much. The next question is a very open question, and I think really, really interesting. It's, how have you considered supplying a default pre-vetted DMSP that all investigators could simply adopt? This is open to all.
I'm happy to start with that. I think we've talked about possibly doing like a HEAL kind of template, but I think in this case, having that broad NIH template, it really is going to help make things interoperable across like the scope of NIH. So having our compliancy requirements on top of that, I think is the best case scenario right now to make sure that we're able to kind of create this ecosystem more broadly of data management and sharing plans that can be interoperable and searched. And as far as creating sort of like a maybe pre-filled in one, there's so many data types across the HEAL ecosystem that it's just really hard to make something that would apply to everyone. So I think for data management and sharing plans, it's really for your study and meant to be a roadmap for your study and help you manage and share your data in the best way that you can by finding those standards and all of that that's right for your data type. So I think, although I know it does take time and we're here to help, I think for now, this is the best case scenario to make sure that you all kind of have the resources you need to make it work best for your study, but also that more broadly, it's going to work with the ecosystem as a whole. But if anyone else wants to jump in on any of that.
Just briefly, in my experience working with researchers on DMSPs outside of HEAL, like Mary Hannah said, I think the variability is pretty huge. And the best ones are really where people spend some time and thought through their particulars. And kind of the more we've seen people kind of copy from sample plans and things like that, the less effective they are. So though it is, an extra step and more work, I think, taking that time to think through these steps will really save you a lot of time later.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Our next question I'd like to direct towards Barry to start. It is, are there different templates for data sharing plans for different kinds of studies? For example, behavioral versus medical versus neuroimaging versus those with or without biosamples, etc.
So this is a great question to follow on the last one. It gets to the variability of the studies that are being produced in research. And the basic answer is no, NIH has only one template, but as you've seen through Mary Hannah's presentation, it's a pretty broad template, and specific institutes or centers or programs may have more specific requirements, like you need to use specific repositories like HEAL does, or like NIMH does, the Mental Health Institute, or may have certain types of data that need to comply with, say, the genomic data sharing policy. But if you look at that template or at those 6 elements of the NIH DMS plan outline, it will accommodate all the variety that and all the extra specificity that might come from an institute or center. So one template, but can accommodate many types of research and many types of data.
Excellent. Thank you, Barry. Our next question is, how do these requirements or policies relate to clinical trials being conducted under INDs for future NDA submissions? Anyone can feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, that is a very exciting question also. I'd ensure to think through the sort of alignment of things that you need to document within clinicaltrials.gov, as well as the package of materials that you're producing for that IND review and approval through the FDA. We think through how to best document those nuances within your DMP. And then also we have thought about this internally as well, and are thinking through ways to potentially provide guidance surrounding the alignment of INDs and some of those processes as well, and how best to potentially support documenting and sharing those materials.
All right, thanks, Anthony. The next question is, are there HEAL-specific guidelines for de-identifying data before publishing or sharing to protect participants' privacy? And I'm going to lob this one to Mary Hannah.
Thanks. So as far as guidance, the HEAL Stewards team has been working on resources for helping researchers walk through de-identifying data. And again, we have that human participant resources that we dropped earlier in the chat, but I would just say be on the lookout for those additional resources and guidance for de-identifying information. We also have subject matter experts on our stewards team that would be happy to talk to you about it. So if you have questions about your particular data set, please reach out to us. And I also wanted to follow up back to Barry's question, just, as you're maybe uploading new versions of things or additional information for a longitudinal study, you just want to make sure that you circle back with your program officers so that they're aware of any updates that need to happen to the data management and sharing plans or to the research performance progress reports. And do you want to add anything about the de-identified data, Anthony, or should we move on?
Yeah, I think in addition to the guidance that the excellent guidance that the stewards are producing, there's processes at each individual repository where there is controlled access and review for these materials, and they have lots of great documentation for all of those pieces. So I think as you're thinking through the particular repository that you're selecting, make certain that they have the appropriate requirements and controls for sensitive data, and then also certainly leverage the excellent guidance that all the stewards are producing and working on. And thank you all for all of your work on producing those.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. And to wrap up, our last question is, Considering sharing data with a project that is longitudinal, if we share the data in several steps or stages, do we upload or share the new data, or can we append or update the one that is already shared? I'm gonna direct this to Barry.
So with the longitudinal study, you would have likely have data being produced and published on in stages. And at the point that you would publish, or at the end of a funding period, you would need to share that data in its current form. It would essentially be a snapshot. And think of a repository as a repository is going to keep that data safe and in good shape at that stage in the process. And if a subsequent cycle of that longitudinal study produces additional data or data that modifies past data or adds different facets to it, you would add that data to the larger data set in its form and leverage the metadata associated with that data to describe the relationships between those data sets.
Thank you so much. All right, I think that was our last question, and that brings us to the end of the webinar today. So I want to say thank you. Thank you so much again to our presenter, Mary Hannah Currin, as well as our Q&A guests, Lucy Carr-Jones, Barry Hayes, and Anthony Juni. We're really grateful for all of your insights today. In addition to our presenters and panelists, we'd like to acknowledge the behind-the-scenes team that worked so hard to bring this webinar to production, and they are listed here. Right. And I want to give a big shout out to the audience for your participation in today's webinar. We hope that you're leaving here with a better understanding of developing HEAL compliant data management and sharing plans. In addition to a recording of the webinar, we'll also email everyone who registered for this event a list of resources that will assist you as you participate more deeply in the HEAL data ecosystem. The slide deck will be shared, and a link to our Slack channel and Connect with Us forum are located in the chat. We hope that you will reach out to us, the HEAL stewards, for questions or support as you embark on your FAIR journey to maximize the value of HEAL data. And finally, we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on May 18th, which will focus on study-level metadata submission to the HEAL data platform via the CEDAR form. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us.